We're going to learn how to make a summer flower, and I've already started my petals in a red and pink thread, what's called a variegated thread, which means that some of the thread is pink and some of it has been dyed red, so that I can just use one thread but still get a nice shaded effect. So it starts off pink here and fades into red down at the bottom of the flower. I really like that effect. Now I'm going to use a back stitch. I've got some little vines that I've drawn in here, and I've got some green thread, and I'm going to use a back stitch to fill in my vines because they're very fine. There wouldn't be any point in using a satin stitch. So to do a back stitch, you look at the point you want to start at, which for me is where this last green stitch ends, and then I'm going to leave a gap between that point and where I bring my needle through. So can you see that? There's a gap between my green stitch and my needle. And then I'm going to bring my needle through there with my thread. And then I'm going to work back, which is why it's called a back stitch. So I'm going to go back to where my original point was, where I left my gap, and I'm going to fill in that gap. Okay, so I'm going to do that again. I'll leave a gap between my last stitch and where my needle comes up. Bring the thread through. Go back to fill in the gap. I'll do that a few more times for you. So leave a gap, bring up your needle, fill in the gap, leave a gap. Oh, getting it wrapped in my fingers, that's why we're jumping around. And then go back, it's a back stitch, to fill in the gap. So that's a back stitch. Now I'm also going to show you how to fill in the center, because circles can be a little bit tricky, well, in anything really, but especially in embroidery. So I'm going to put away this needle so that it's out of my way, not being a danger to anyone. Now I'm using a sort of peachy bronzy colour in my centre. You want to make your entry into the very middle of your circle. You can see I've done a few stitches already. I've just created a knot on the back. Just pick it out if you do that. Because we're doing a circle, we quite often are working over old stitches, so it's easy to make knots and to get your tail tangled, so be careful with your tail. And then I'm going to make a stitch right next to the last stitch I did, coming right to the edge of my circle. It's okay if your threads in the middle cross over, but it's not okay to leave white gaps. That looks really ugly and unprofessional. And it does become quite difficult to get it where you want because there's so many threads in the centre, all filling in spaces. So I've got it right in the centre again. I'm going to fill in here. The fewer threads you have in your needle, the easier it'll be to pull your thread through, but it will be more difficult to, well, it won't be more difficult, but it will take you longer to fill in the space. Okay, so I'm just going to come to the side. As you can see, I am very slowly forming a circle. My threads in the centre are overlapping. Like I say, that's okay. I just don't want any blank spaces. Close as I can. If you just continue to do this, you should eventually end up with a circle. That's me at sort of a half circle now almost. Let's see if I take it right across there so that I'm actually at a half circle, and then I can fill in the gap. If you find that easier, go ahead. It can help you to keep your circle looking neat and tidy. I maybe only need 1 or 2 stitches to fill in that space. There. 1 more. So we're using a satin stitch for all of our petals. If you want to do any buds, we want a satin stitch for that also. I'm using a back stitch for my vines. I've got a few tiny little leaves on there, which I'll use a satin stitch to fill in. And we're using this circular satin stitch in the center. And that's how you make a summer flower.